Hello, welcome to day. This is day 2 of recording, but I guess if we're journaling this is technically journal number 3, entry number 3 into the universal model vlog thing. Now, I know this is probably annoying, but this megaphone is helping me out get my thoughts across. I will have it changed in time, but I would like to talk about some miniature discoveries today, and we can go over some notes I took today, what worked on, and plans for the next couple days, because I have some ideas. So, let's just kick it off. I've got notes this time in front of me. I've got actual notes. So if we scroll through here, here's what I did today. I woke up, read some philosophy or class, went to philosophy class, went to communications class, then I went to just read a book about habits, and then that's all the work I did besides some math. Later in the day I just chilled, but I think you gotta have that good balance. So let's talk about notes. On the philosophy side of things, earlier today, working with the model and philosophy, not much happened. I just read the readings. It was on evil and God and arguments for and against God's existence, if evil exists, and blah 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 blah. There was one interesting section about free will, but I can't really relate to the model that much. But on the free will note, if there is any sort of project or like little paper I should write first, that's like 1,000 words maybe, I think one of the best arguments I have with the model and mathematics is with the calculus behind free will, because I have my presumptions and I can make my logical arguments. So I should write those down tomorrow. So here's the plan. Here's what I have to do tomorrow. Tomorrow I should work on the free will philosophical arguments with universal model calculus. Start writing that down. I should finish up my letters of rec with some professors, working with them. And I should email my philosophy professor and ask if he would like to talk about free will and consciousness, since next week is also mind-body problems and more. So we've got that. And now next up on the philosophy, after philosophy came comms. And communications is actually being pretty useful in exploring other ideas for the model. It's surprising. I was not expecting it. But if we go to day 4, this day was about metaphors. The conduit metaphor of like packing ideas into containers, words, and sending them to someone else and they just receive it. But the implications of this metaphor is that meaning is unproblematically conveyed by language when there's miscommunication in reality. The listener is a passive recipient when in reality their reactions have impacts in the communication, and they interpret different meanings, just like the unproblematic conveying of the language. And then the third thing is that thinking and understanding is an abstract process that pertains to the individual and is isolated from communicating and talking. And that's also wrong, because in reality, when we communicate, that's when we do some of our best thinking, because we have to think about how to get the words across. So the whole conduit metaphor kind of separates it, but I wasn't really thinking the conduit metaphor in the first place with communication. I'd taken that conduit and I had already jumbled it up. So in the conduit metaphor, you've got 2 nodes, right? One node sends information to the other node. Each node is a person sending the info as the language. Yeah. Now in the model, important things, interactions are key, and apertures. So aperture could be like a paragraph or a sentence. It's like the type of container that's being sent is the aperture. The complexity of it, different categories in it. It's like the structure of it, and then so you've got those 2. That's a decent model until you go with these issues. Now, in my version of the conduit metaphor, I was being kind of weird with it, where it wasn't just a straight line between the two. It was down to every syllable when you send it out, every word. So you've got two objects and a conduit in the middle. I'll start having stuff drawn out, but actually I can draw it out on here. So let's see. Item, conduit, right? Person, conduit. Now, in my version, I had time as a variable, and more, time was kind of it was like, which word are you on? It wasn't strictly temporal, it was like location in the sentence, since our sentences read left to right temporally in our minds. So that's one effect, where each word that gets sent out, if you think about it for a moment and you're thinking about what to say next, like I'm doing right now, if you're the sender, blah blah blah, there's a loop that goes back in on yourself. And to me, that was another conduit. And then for the receiver, they've got a loop of reaction, right? And it gets more complicated. Now here's the cool thing. In the model, the key of all the model studies that I'm starting to discover is just measure the loops in emergence. So you've got hierarchies and novelty and entropy and all this stuff. And you could have two loops going on, right, individually. Two simple apertures going on with their interactions, two little systems looping. But when the loops come together and they intersect at that center point, that's where you start get emerging complexity. Because if two loops are interacting in the middle, it creates a larger loop going on. And that larger loop isn't necessarily strictly simple. That large loop is a complicated process. So you start measuring loops like that. I can draw this. I'm figuring out how to graph it in my mind right now too with 3D calculators, but so there's that. So that's a cool feature. And then with loops, we can start defining life forms. Which loops stay? Which loops are accelerating to keep themselves alive more? Which loops are gonna die out? Which loops are stable, unstable, stuff like that. So that's where the life form studies come in. And you can start studying the communications with those loops. And then that's when you just get your final calculation of consciousness of where's the most important self-referential systems in play. And this one of talking out loud is key. Because at least in my experience of consciousness, everyone experiences it a little bit differently. In mine, I speak to myself in my mind nonstop. Some people don't even have that ability. It's like a very small percent, but it's crazy the differences in experience we all have. But in my scenario, when this goes on, it's like, if you speak the words in your mind, they'll affect the next ones. It's the same thing when you're speaking out loud. But when you're speaking out loud, there's more impact to your thoughts, so you're like more careful about it. Yeah, you get all these different loops. So that was some cool stuff with communications, and then they were like discussing the shape of the lecture hall and how that impacts students, how that impacts like the student experience with the professor and how it's very one-sided. And I was designing some cool, so better systems are like neurally based systems. They can solve problems better. I'm not sure if they can teach better besides a single feed-forward system, but one of the cool ideas I had in the past few months was designing these like neurally based mega rooms where your seats and stuff would shift and you'd have little groups, little loops, little groups and loops, and they would be working on a problem. Timer would go off. Those groups are required to send their information out to the other local ones, and each group could be like a different science department, whatever. And then this lasts for a few hours, and like you'll have that working, and then the feed forward system of one person feeding forward information to like 100 is kind of like a hormone, when like a hormone wave rushing through all the neurons in your brain, triggering everything at once, kind of in a more general sense. you'd have that with like a central speaker or whatever. So you could start creating these cool different structures to try and solve problems. So that was another neural situation that I was thinking of. I've only got a minute left of recording on my phone, so I gotta delete some space. I'll probably have to stitch these together, so I'll be right back. Focus. Focus. Alright, we're back. I freed up some space on my phone, and I can record for a bit longer. I know this video is kind of long, but it's practice. So yeah. And the mobile room idea. Like, that's where I want to use the panel inventions, is in these big modular rooms. And I know you don't need the panels to do it, but if you go to Center Space and it's got all this insane tech, there's just a level of inspiration that you can gain from it. So there's that. And then with the Atomic Habits book, reading Atomic Habits, which notes that right here. So one of the key pieces was just arguing that habits decrease our mental load that we have to think about because they're automatic, and like that makes sense and all that. But what's cool to think about is if we think about mental load as all these recursions overlapping and you have to think about it all at once. Building the habit is basically taking one of those loops that's interacting with the others, separating it, placing it elsewhere, and then because it's placed elsewhere in your center brain where you're doing the all-at-once calculations that run your consciousness, you don't have to worry about that little loop because it's running automatically. It has a tinge of consciousness that you interact with, because when it triggers, you still feel the effects of it, but you're not necessarily having to run that calculation day in, day out. So that's like evolutionarily the importance of habits. And then there's also, I'm going to connect that to Sun Tzu, Art of War. It's weird, but some of the diagrams in both books look too similar not to try and connect them, because the habit is just about how do you take action automatically, and in Sun Tzu it was about how do you determine which actions to take, and the loops, the like looped process of like getting a cue signal, gathering info, doing the action, seeing the result is similar. And then yeah, I was arguing that identity is just repeated habits and other things of the sorts. Nothing too much. Oh, let's read off this note. This note's kind of cool. Give me one moment. Okay, this is a fun proof that I want to argue too. I should work on this one soon. So I wrote down, let's study addiction as a conscious impact force, a mental barrier that manifests in the real world. So what this is saying is that we can be conscious of our decisions, like smoke a cigarette or not, but once you get addicted, you not being able to stop has a physical impact on the real world, because that cigarette or a cigarette structure object will be with you a lot. And that's a physical relationship you can measure in the real world that's happening in your mind based on feelings. And now, obviously those feelings are based on the neural structures, because the neural structure is telling you go grab a cigarette. But we feel that, and we feel the need to grab it. And we can study the self-referentialness of those feelings and how those feelings are basically self-fulfilling prophecies. So then I said, based on this info, we're saying that we're allowed to count cigarettes as objects in the universe. Now, some people might argue like, oh, objects are all just made in our minds. Like, then we also have to count, like, say, stars. Even if we consider them objects, then they're not separate from other stuff. But having objects in the world is useful to our brains. And we can quantify the patterns of these objects. And because they carry specific patterns, I think it's okay that I think that objects exist in some form. Now, what this argument is saying is that obviously in like 99.999% of science and everything we do, we have objects like this jar. But who's to say that objects are not just a figment of everyone's imagination? I think that's not true. I think objects have a certain percentage of reality that our brains attribute to it, and then the other percentage is the illusion of the object. And what I mean by that is, if we argue that the cigarette as an object is made up, then we argue the stars are made up. But we can't argue the human mind is not made up as an object, because we experience its boundaries and patterns. And what this is saying is, everything's conscious. Now, the human mind is conscious, right? Now, we can count our consciousness as an object, because if we count consciousness as like physical, not physical matter, but having material impact, we can count our conscious structure as an object, because our consciousness has barriers. Our senses are barriers to our conscious experience. I can't experience what you're experiencing when you watch this video. I don't even know if you're real or not, but there's barriers within our experience. And those barriers are like the barriers to the object definition. I know that sounds very basic, but if we can prove philosophically, mathematically, that objects have not intrinsic, what's the word? It's like in what the fuck is the word? Sorry for cussing. What the hell is the word? Irreducible. The boundary is like irreducible. The consciousness is so complex, but the calculations are irreducible. They all require each other, and that forms an object. And then the cigarette has a level of irreducibility. We apply a lot of illusion to the cigarette, but there's a small percent that's real in its patterns and its interactions with the world. So we can count that as an object, and we can count that object with conscious impact force, on like the force of trying to get over the habits and all that. We can start using physics terms and stuff. So overall, that was just me arguing that identifying objects is valid. And if we argue the identification of the object is valid within the context of our universe, then we can identify different universal structures and objects with the model. Well, no, that would literally just be the model, is those structures. So that gives us basis for developing it. Yes, I like that. That's another proof I should write. See, this is good. This is good talking about it, because now I've got a lot of like starting points I can go off of. This is good. I don't think there's much more, and I'm probably tiring you guys out now. There's another thing I gotta research later called ontological engineering, which is like the study of objects, and ontology is like just basics of philosophy, but that's for another day. I'll start getting visuals up and going on the screen. I'll get a decent little camera going. Actually, I don't need a camera, I just need a tripod. We got phones, who cares about the quality of this? The lighting, I think it's good for now. No need to waste money. I'll get the little robots going soon. I'll get this guy going. Basically, my idea with the invention for this, extend a bit of fabric to like right here around the whole rim, put some motors right here, and then to the beat of the music or to the level of noise, the motors will push out a rod. The rod will expand. At the tip of the rod, it's connected to the fabric, so it stretches the fabric. So then when I speak like this piece will like go in and out like that. Boom, boom, boom. I think it'd be really cool. Probably won't use it on video because it'd be noisy, but it'd be fun. So, thank you to anyone listening. Even if no one's listening, that's all good. Sorry, I got distracted. All right.